Okay, so I want to turn things over now to Joe Graves. Joe is a professor at NCA&T and a part of TRISEM, and he's also a part of our organizing committee. And so Joe is going to introduce Nina for us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlie. It is a truly great honor to introduce my colleague and friend, Dr. Nina Jablonski. For those of you that don't know my scholarship, I work on the genomics of adaptation, but one of the applications of that is biological and social conceptions of race. So I was actually reading Dr. Jablonski's work long before I met her, because she represents the gold standard of research around the evolution of skin coloration in humans. I first met her on the order of 7 years ago at the National Evolutionary Synthesis Center, which was the precursor to TRISEM. And we saw, I don't want to put words in Nina's mouth, but we sort of hit it off right away. And we began to work together on projects, particularly around improving the understanding of genetics and evolution in middle schoolers, particularly amongst underrepresented and underserved minority populations. So with that said, I would like to turn over this presentation to my friend and colleague, Dr. Nina Jablonski.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you, Meredith. Thank you, Charlie, for your invitation and a lovely introduction. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be with this august group with whom I share so many interests. I want to start out by saying what I'm going to try to talk about today is an overview of what I've been doing for the last 25 or so years. As you can appreciate, it's going to be a gloss in about 15 minutes, but I'm hopeful that you will ask probing questions that some parts of this presentation allude to. I'm also always available by email, and my bibliography is on a variety of websites. So please don't hesitate to follow up if you have further questions. Just going to get us started here. There we go. This presentation is going to be perhaps less about the evolutionary medicine aspects of the evolution of human skin color, and more about how we can talk about it as evolutionary biologists and educators, which is why I wanted to open up with basically the conclusions of the talk, that we now understand that human skin color is pretty well understood as an adaptive phenotype, and that we can explain it to a wide variety of people, including children and people that don't have advanced biology education. That skin color has been used to construct races. In the European Enlightenment, skin color was the cardinal feature used to create races. This is something that we can explicate and understand even more readily than we can understand the evolutionary facts. And evolutionary biologists can grasp and convey this history.
Dr. Jablonski, I'm sorry to interrupt you. There's a couple of black boxes on the screen that we aren't able to see your slides fully.
Oh, hold on.
Apologies about that.
Let me just see if I can get rid of.
I have a feeling it's the
How's that?
window, possibly.
How's that?
They're still there, but smaller.
Yikes.
Yeah, I'm very sorry to interrupt. I had people messaging me wanting to see the full.
I'm just trying to get us out of out of the way. Is that better, Meredith?
Yes, it is a small black bar across the top, but not obstructing.
Okay, I think that's as far as I can get it off right now.
Okay. It's definitely better.
All right. if it becomes obtrusive, I don't think it'll bother anyone up there.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. A third sort of pre-conclusion is that when we talk about this, whether we're talking about evolutionary facts or hypotheses, or about the implications for our understanding of human diversity and race, that language is important. And lastly, and this is something that Joe alluded to in his introduction, early childhood education can be remarkably effective. And we think that this is one of the important pathways to the future in helping people understand the origins of human physical diversity and the relationship of skin color to human relations. People have known for a very long time, many centuries in fact, that human skin color is geographically arranged in a way that makes a lot of sense with respect to the intensity of sunlight. We started writing about this in the year 2000 in an overview paper, a theoretical and data paper in the Journal of Human Evolution. And what we did at that time was we showed more clearly than previous workers that skin pigmentation was directly related, was directly correlated rather, with the intensity of ultraviolet radiation, primarily UVB, but also UVA, and that we could understand the array of modern skin tones with respect to ultraviolet radiation at the Earth's surface. In order to be able to show this conclusively, we called upon NASA satellite remotely sensed data that was then available. We had a wonderful data CD that was sent to us by a NOAA scientist many years ago. Now all those data are downloadable. But what we were able to show is that annual average ultraviolet radiation is highly correlated with human skin pigmentation. In this map, the most intense areas of UV are shown in bright red and hot pink, and less intense, more seasonal areas of especially UVB are shown in gray. And the tones of modern indigenous skin color are correlated at a greater than or explained rather, almost 87% only by UVR at the Earth's surface. As we have thought about the evolution of human skin pigmentation, we really had to reconstruct things from the beginning. In this hairy timeline of human evolution, which is one of my favorite graphics of all time, on the left side, you see that we diverged from our chimpanzee ancestors about 7.5 million years ago, and using a variety of comparative anatomical and paleontological deductions, we determined that that common ancestor living around 7.5 million years ago was quite hairy with lightly pigmented skin. But by about 2 to 1.5 million years ago, there's good evidence to indicate that humans were mostly naked. They had a very sweaty skin, and that living in equatorial Africa as they were, that they at that time evolved permanent dark skin pigmentation under their mostly hairless bodies. And so in the early evolution of the genus Homo, and this is a reconstruction from my 2006 book, by this reconstruction by Mauricio Antón, what we see is a putative Homo erectus with hair on his head, but very little body hair, capable of getting rid of a lot of excess body heat through sweating and having darkly pigmented skin, which is highly protective against the multiple depredations of strong ultraviolet radiation. And what we did in the course of that first paper and in many subsequent papers is really show that skin pigmentation is an evolutionary compromise, primarily between the needs of protecting against very strong and mostly non-seasonal ultraviolet radiation near the equator and certainly within the tropics. So photoprotection being one major natural selection force. And then on the other hand, the demands of photosynthesis of vitamin D that promoted active positive selection for loss of melanin pigmentation as humans dispersed outside of the tropics and especially north of the Tropic of Cancer. It's worth noting here that the area of the Earth's surface north of the Tropic of Cancer is far greater than the area south of the Tropic of Capricorn, and a lot of people dispersed into those far northern latitudes. So our paradigm, as we established it over the course of about 10 years, really can be summarized by this slide. What we hypothesized and have since shown in a variety of ways is that the primary selective force for the evolution of dark, highly eumelanin-rich skin is protection against ultraviolet radiation-induced breakdown of folate, one of the key B vitamins, and several of its bioactive chemical relatives that are important in DNA synthesis and DNA regulation and in many other key cellular processes. Ultraviolet radiation does a lot of other negative things. It causes direct damage to DNA, which promotes skin cancer, but most of these other direct effects of ultraviolet radiation do not affect reproductive success, whereas UV-induced breakdown of folate and its biochemical relatives does very much affect reproductive success. When we envisioned the process of the evolution of human skin pigmentation, we start out with early Homo, and in fact, early Homo sapiens in equatorial Africa, and then dispersing out from equatorial Africa. Again, this depends on paleontological and archaeological dates, but around 70 to 80,000 years ago over the Afro-Arabian land bridge into southern and Southeast Asia, and then later into Europe, Northeast Asia, and thence into the Americas. So basically what we see is a pattern of humans, including early Homo sapiens, first evolving in very high UV environments in Africa. I always emphasize that Homo sapiens had more than its first 2/3 of its evolutionary history exclusively or mostly in Africa, and that everything that we talk about with respect to modernity in technology, language, art, and communication was born during that time of tremendous cultural and biological evolution of early Homo sapiens in Africa. And the subsequent dispersals that we see are of small populations, that's very important, small populations into Eurasia and much later into the Americas. So you can see here that one of the key points is that some of these dispersals, especially in the late Pleistocene, are occurring into areas of very low and highly seasonal UV. And clearly, we need to understand how not only darkly pigmented, but very lightly pigmented people evolved. And here we point to the primary selective force for the evolution of depigmented skin as the promotion of ultraviolet radiation-induced vitamin D production. Most ultraviolet radiation, especially the more energetic form, UVB, is very dangerous. It causes damage to many parts of the skin, to blood circulating through the dermis, to the DNA in the skin. But a little bit of UVB radiation is helpful and healthful because it does promote the photosynthesis of vitamin D in the skin from a cholesterol-like precursor. And so this is important to reproductive success as well, being able to get enough vitamin D to be able to promote the construction and maintenance of strong skeletons, musculoskeletal systems, immune systems, and everything else that is dependent on vitamin D requires that vitamin D be made primarily in the skin. Diet is a very, very, very secondary source of vitamin D. We now understand a lot of the genetics of skin pigmentation, and I'm not going to go into what was reviewed very nicely in that paper that I distributed to the group called Shades of Color or Shades of Complexity. First author, Ellen Quillen, because that really summarizes much of what we know about the genetics of skin pigmentation, including the various pathways of depigmentation and the many pathways that have led to tanning. But one of the most important insights into the evolution of skin pigmentation came over a decade ago when it was recognized that the two primary depigmented phenotypes of human skin that we see in Northwestern Europe and Northeastern Asia evolved in parallel. So that there is the shared KIT ligand mutation that the two populations shared, but since, well, in about the last 30,000 years, the next steps of depigmentation that occurred as these populations moved farther into the extremities, the rather sunless extremities of Europe and Northern Asia, have occurred entirely independently through independent mutation events. Great stuff. This is just a small list of the genes that we know about, and the evolution of depigmentation in Asia is still being studied very, very actively. When we look at the wide variety of people with darkly, moderately, or darkly pigmented skin, we also can increasingly recognize the action of parallel evolution, especially in the promotion of different complexes of genes that promote tanning during the lifespan, tanning to a very dark level, so that you have, for instance, many groups in the New World that are born as sort of lightly to moderately pigmented people, but they have enormous abilities to tan in response to exposure to ultraviolet radiation. So they can develop some level of eumelanin protection against the depredations of ultraviolet radiation. One of the I think, most important insights from the genetics of skin pigmentation. This is not work done by me, but done by colleagues of mine at Penn State and many other universities and institutes in the world, is that the genes that control pigmentation are mostly independent of those that control or influence other phenotypic traits. Although there is some overlap between skin pigmentation and eye and hair color pigmentation genes, this is much less than people originally thought. And both eye and hair pigmentation are controlled by other suites of genes that in turn don't influence skin pigmentation. And then many of the other traits that have been used to classify people or sort people into various adaptive groups, even things like head shape, nose shape, ear shape, these kinds of things, height, and so forth. These are all caused by traits, by genes rather, that are entirely unrelated to pigmentation genes. So I think this is really, really important, that many of the complexes of traits that were used to place people into groups in the 18th century are not caused by sort of unified complexes of genes that march together in evolutionary time. Rather, they're created as sort of temporary assemblies of genes that have had many independent trajectories. So similar skin colors have evolved independently, both darkly pigmented and tannable and depigmented skin pigmentation have evolved independently many times under similar UV conditions and can't be used, therefore, as unique markers of group or race identity. One of the things that I've done a lot in the last 10 years is unpack this story with respect to how we talk about the evolution of skin pigmentation. When I first began this work, it was straight biology, straight evolutionary biology and evolutionary medicine. But then people appropriately would say, well, what does this have to say about our concepts of race? And this is where I began to delve into a lot of European and American history. And to make a fairly long story scandalously short, I will say that, again, skin color was the primary feature that was used not only by scientists of the Enlightenment, but also by their classical Greek precursors to sort people into named groups. We know the Enlightenment scholars better than others. We know Linnaeus, the systematist. We know Immanuel Kant, David Hume. We know the other people who are called early anthropologists. All of them used as their primary sorting criterion skin color to parse people into groups. We know when they did this, how they did this, and largely why they did this. They became aware of these groups mostly as the result of getting reports from others. These were not widely traveled people. They relied on travelers' tales, explorers' reports, and so forth. Needless to say, these were not impartial or scientific reports for the most part. And these early descriptions of human groups or races were constructed in a very pejorative way. Yes, they list different physical criteria of color and hair texture or eye shape, but they also talk, even beginning with Linnaeus and some of the later editions of Systema Naturae, They talk about the character of groups of people, the moral predilections of groups of people, their willingness to abide by laws, and so forth. So what we see in the early biological classifications of humans compared to other animals is very much judgment about the quality, about the potential, about the moral behavior of people that is mentioned as part of these biological definitions. Needless to say, these become the core of many of our racial stereotypes as we get beyond the 18th into the 19th century, as the influence of the transatlantic slave trade begins to not only bear on all of humanity, but as abolitionist forces work to get rid of the slave trade, but slavery practices continue, especially in the New World. Racial stereotypes helped to reinforce negative and inhuman depictions of people who were not Europeans. And these, I'm sad to say, have persisted almost untouched to the present day. And this is why we have to examine this whole process, because these stereotypes have now become what we would call color memes and have formed the psychosocial template for much of modern racism in the world. I've written at length about this in a variety of places, but would be happy to entertain further questions about it. But we can talk about this stuff. The knowledge of human skin color, of the evolution of human skin color, and the invention of color-based races is something that we can explicate. And we can explain these things simply to a wide variety of audiences. And this conduces to some really good things, an appreciation of human diversity, at least of some aspects of human physical diversity. It helps to understand inherent human equality, that something as simple as skin pigmentation, an adaptation to variation ultraviolet radiation, has been used to sort of determine who is more or less better than someone else. The absurdity of that construct becomes manifest as soon as you talk about the evolution of human skin pigmentation. And when you talk about this also in relation to the construction, the historical construction of race concepts, we can reduce racism, because people can see clearly how these facts were assembled at a particular time in human history and marshaled for particular economic reasons. We know, based on our experience as evolutionary biologists, and in many cases as educators, that evolution and race are topics that are really avoided in classrooms, especially in K through 12 contexts. I would argue that this is just the place where they need to be introduced. And I know many of you share these ideas. My colleagues at Penn State, Mike Berkman and Eric Plutzer, 2010 wrote an excellent book about education and evolution in America that was based on an excellent, huge survey that they did that was funded by the NSF and other foundations. To make a long story short and to not preempt their excellent book, what they did was they identified teachers as what they called enablers of doubt. When teachers themselves had doubts about evolution or human evolution specifically and didn't want to talk about it, that this really, really led to sort of festering lack of understanding of these processes of evolution and human evolution in K through 12 classrooms. And this becomes sort of an unsaid foundation of ignorance in much of American society. We now hear a lot, and not only since George Floyd, but since all of the Black Lives Matter protests, even beginning before 2014, that it's really important that we help to teach adults about how races were constructed and how implicit bias takes hold of people's minds and decision-making processes. Without going into this, I would argue that these are really trying to get the horse back in the barn way too late, and that what we need to do is, and what will be far more cost effective, in fact, is focus on training students about the evolution of human physical diversity and the construction of races in K through 12 contexts. Focus on changing our education system, especially early childhood education, rather than in changing the minds of adults. A few years ago, I do a lot of work in South Africa, and I joined together with a South African novelist of great note, Sindiwe Magona, and she and Lynn Fellman and I brought out a book that we're very proud of, that's widely used now in South Africa to teach about the evolution of skin color and race constructs. I'm happy to say that it's available in all 12 official languages of South Africa and is distributed freely to many schools and school libraries. I'm happy to say also that I'm in the process of writing another book for the American or North American audience with 2 new collaborators for a different press. But more to the point, and something alluded to earlier by Joe in his very nice introduction, is that many of us years ago felt strongly that we could do better about teaching about the evolution of human biological evolution, human inherent equality, and human diversity by targeting younger audiences. We really got our incentive from a few different sources, but one of them in the center of the photo here is Skip Gates from Harvard, who for many years has been hosting public broadcasting shows that talk about genetics and genealogy, helping people to reconstruct their ancestry through the written historical record as well as through their DNA evidence. What Skip thought many years ago was, well, couldn't we bring this into the classroom for kids? And the project that has grown up in the last 10 years and with whom I worked with Joe and these many other people, basically got its start from Skip's early ideas as well as those of Mark Weiss from the National Science Foundation. We all felt that we can do better, but that we had to start earlier. We eventually got funds to be able to start a series of summer camps in which we introduced kids to the basics of evolutionary biology and quantitative thinking and genetics and the biology of human diversity in an elective summer camp setting. Kids investigated their own DNA ancestry and genealogy, and they explored humanity's shared genetic heritage. So we taught them a little bit about the broad genetic diversity of humans, showed how mostly we were tremendously alike and that we varied very little in our genetic complement. And we talked about those interesting ways in which people did vary, including the evolution of skin pigmentation. And we tried to explain as best and simply we could how these patterns of variation had evolved. So we had kids who were hands-on doing science. These were empowered kids who were working with camp instructors and one main camp teacher. They did a lot of their own work with one another, as well as with computer support, but it was great for team building. And they also had some independent projects that they worked on. What we did was we realized that these camps were useful and successful and that the world should know about them. So we sought to create some outreach tools whereby we could get the information about these camps and more broadly about human diversity education out to a larger audience. And so with, again, some generous funding from various small and large foundations, we created this website, and I would urge you to go to that if you're interested, where you'll find a series of 9 videos. These are really sort of takeoffs on Skip Gates's Finding Your Roots adult videos. These are videos of our kids at camp doing various things, doing a lot of basic science, figuring out what DNA is, what taxonomy is, what human evolution is, how skin pigmentation evolved, and many other interesting things, and how you can investigate these things on yourself. What we saw was a tremendous level of student interest and engagement. These kids really got into it. We had an excellent curriculum writer, and what she did was make sure that each kid did their own projects. They had a day in this whole camp in which to create their own projects, and they were massively creative, showing a lot of self-direction, a lot of motivation. We empowered them to do what they wanted to do. And since the time of these camps, the kids have taken their knowledge to their relatives, friends, and family gatherings months after the camp. Years after the camp, we've had some of our campers who have gone on to teach their classmates. This young woman shown on the left has gone on to win a scholarship to a very prominent high school in Atlanta, largely as the result of the science projects that she led after our camp. So what we feel very strongly that this hit so many buttons, as it were. It pushed so many buttons. It allowed us to sort of discuss the evolution of humans, discuss the evolution of human physical diversity, allowed us to explain simply how human physical diversity was used to classify people into groups that made no sense, how those groups were used to separate people against one another, and the lack of sense that made. When kids 10, 11, 12 years old are presented with that information, it makes sense to them. And they basically say, why have people messed it up so badly? And although we have only done these camps and tested the efficacy of our curriculum on only about 60 kids total, we have confidence that this approach is going to be more efficacious in the future. And we're hoping for more and more sort of iterations of this in various ways. I'm going to stop there and thank many people, including the early working group at NESCENT that Joe referred to, our funding organizations, National Science Foundation, Robert Wood Johnson, and Rockefeller Foundation foremost, and my own university and the College of Liberal Arts at Penn State for tremendous support. Lots of papers for those of you who really want to dig more deeply into this. And I'm always, as I said at the outset, available on email. So I'll close there and invite people's questions.
That was great, Nina. Thank you very much. That was a fantastic overview of a lot of your work. And
sorry,
I know we have quite a few questions that are popping up in the chat box. Do we also have any hands raised, Meredith?
We do. We have a hand raised by Riyad Abed. Riyad, you can go ahead with your question.
Yes, thank you very much. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes.
Can you speak up a little bit? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Thank you.
Got
Thank
it.
you very much for a very interesting presentation. I was interested in your comment about the fact that nutrition is not an important source of vitamin D. Are the Inuits the exception to this to this rule? That's my first question. Second is what do we know about the Neanderthals with regards to hairiness and skin color?
Right. In connection with your first question, yes, Inuit are traditional Inuit and also other circumpolar peoples who eat a lot of marine mammals and to a lesser extent caribou or reindeer are exceptions to this because they eat highly vitamin D rich foods, especially in their traditional diets. And so what I often say is they've sort of been able to sort of cheat evolution because they can live in very UV poor and highly seasonal UV environments, but get plenty of vitamin D from nutritional sources. In connection with your second question, the Neanderthal phenotypes, we've known something about them for about 13 years. They appear to have had, at least some of them, quite lightly pigmented skin and at least some reconstructions based on sort of functional reconstructions of MC1R genotypes have estimated that at least some of the individuals would have been red-headed. They were probably mostly hairless as far as we can tell from the configuration of their sweat gland prescribing genes. But now that we have a larger sample of Neanderthal DNA, their skin pigmentation phenotype was probably far more variable than we first credited for. I mean, Neanderthals were around for a long time. They've been padding around much of the circum-Mediterranean and Central Europe, you know, for over 100,000 years and much longer than that, depending on what you call a Neanderthal. And so many of those populations, no doubt, had more darkly pigmented skin, highly tannable skin. We may never know precisely what their skin pigmentation was, but certainly it was highly variable. I'm not convinced that we can ever do really good reconstructions of skin pigmentation phenotypes on the basis of ancient DNA. There's far too much that we don't know about epistasis between pigmentation genes to be able to make, I think, dogmatic pronouncements about this ancient population being a particular lightly or darkly colored variant. I think we need to be very, very cautious of that, whether we're talking about ancient ancestors or forensic cases.
Great, thank you for that. Next, we have a question from Megan Holmes. Megan, you can go ahead with your question.
Thank you, Meredith. Thank you so much for the presentation, Dr. Jablonski. It's amazing work you guys are doing. I'm curious on the reaction that you've gotten from K through 12 educators as you've introduced this curriculum to their classroom. And I'm also curious and hopeful whether or not you might be creating deliverables that us non-expert scientists in skin pigmentation evolution can use to bring to our local classrooms.
Yeah, great questions. Nearly all of the K through 12 educators with whom we've had contact have been enthusiastic, but they have a few concerns, primarily like who's going to teach the teachers. That's the biggest concern, because many of them are motivated to learn this stuff themselves, and we've gone out of our way to make sure that our curriculum is constructed on, on modern standards, science standards, so that we hit all of the sort of the benchmarks that are needed. But we need to be able to get into teacher training programs, because this cannot be more widely adopted unless teachers feel a level of comfort having gotten this really early in their own education. We can't leave this to individuals' own recognizance. In connection with the second part of your question, we have a lot of materials already available for download on our fyrclassroom.org website. You'll find the sort of the curriculum as a whole, the camp curriculum in, as a whole in various forms, as well as in downloadable modules. And what we've promoted to people is using this in after-school programs, and make it flexible. We're now trying, like right now, trying to repurpose it for a lot of virtual classrooms, because we realize that there are lots and lots of teachers, including parents who are homeschooling their kids, who really want to be able to do some of this stuff at home. And so we're trying to get funds right now to be able to do that. But all I can say is I'm confident that we're going to have more support for this in the near future. A major funder has just presented themselves literally last week, and we are scampering to try to work with them. And if our sort of wish list comes true, many of these materials will be readily available for teachers, parents, and I hope to the teachers of teachers.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for that. I'm excited to look at those resources once this meeting's over. Next up, we have a question from Debjani Swain-Lentz. Debbie, you can go ahead.
Thank you for your presentation. I always appreciate when somebody is very thoughtful and teaching us how to be responsible about genetics. So I have a question about development. So I would I feel like it's naively think that when we have people who go through pigmentation changes and can tan later in life, like Indians, that it would actually be more beneficial at an early age to have folate protection, right? Mm-hmm. So why are we seeing tanning later in life instead of depigmentation later in life?
Yeah, we see that people at their maximal darkness for whatever whatever their group may be, we see this occurring in the latest teens, earliest 20s. So basically in peak reproductive years, that's when we see people who have the sort of the best melanin production abilities and the darkest skin phenotypes. And again, we really want more people to work on this question of, you know, early childhood phenotypes, and on the question of sexual dimorphism, because in every indigenous group studied, women are more lightly pigmented than men. Our unproven hypothesis is that this helps to promote vitamin D production in women, because they need to produce more vitamin D for sort of every photon of UVB that they're exposed to. They need to be able to convert this to vitamin D in order to facilitate absorption of calcium from dietary sources. So, you know, that there's a lot that we still don't know, but the short answer to your question is we see peak pigmentation in the early and really for our species, peak reproductive years, the late teens and early 20s, and it falling off certainly after into the third and fourth decades.
Great, thank you for that. So jumping to the chat box, Aaron Sandel just put in, which I think is a pretty big question. So he says that studying skin color variation and the fallacy of the biological basis to race can serve an anti-racist function in classrooms, which is great. In a way, this serves as a counterpoint to biological determinism and race constructs, but it also runs the risk of supporting biological deterministic thinking insofar as we are talking about the genetic basis of human traits. So how do we reconcile this and more generally confront the racist history of natural selection and genetics and adaptive explanations of human behavior?
Yeah. Thanks, Erin. Hi, nice to hear from you. A very good question. I think we need to always be forthright about this and understand that, yes, we understand the genetic basis of some human traits. We don't understand the genetic basis for all human traits, but that when we look at any individual, what we see is basically, you know, sort of an interesting jumble of genes that determine our visible or perceptible phenotype. And I think that's pretty cool. And we can show that, you know, even within a family where people share a lot of genes, that there's a tremendous amount of genetic variation. And so that the idea that these can be, that genes are deterministic, well, yes, they influence our appearance, but there's so much variation even within single families that it's hard to be dogmatic about how they, you know, they influence things in a sort of directional way. Also, when we look at for instance, in some of Sarah Tishkoff's recent work on genetic diversity within the continent of Africa, what she has been able to show is just this tremendous, I mean, enormous depth and breadth of genetic diversity within this, you know, supercontinent of Africa, that has led to, you know, the evolution of people really in many different sort of shapes and forms and you know, wondrously different configurations. So I think the more that we actually understand this, the more that we can say, listen, you know, we're all sort of like these fruit salad combos. I'm not trying to diminish the importance of this, but everyone is this congeries of, you know, genetic components, and there's very little deterministic, and there's certainly very little sort of grouping about it. So I think the more that we know, the less likely we can actually create anything like racial constructs. The other thing that is really important is that all of the stuff that has come out in the last 15 years on epigenetics in the broadest sense is showing us that even if you have a particular gene for a particular trait, it may be under or overexpressed depending on your on the environment in which you developed, in which you're now interacting with the world. So I think when we introduce this to kids in a simple way, it gives them enough understanding to be able to say, yeah, there's a genetic basis to, you know, to sort of how I look and to how other people look, and that this depends on a lot of different things. A lot of genes interact with one another, and the environment interacts with our genes, and boy, this is really complicated and interesting. That's not deterministic. That becomes an object of wonder.
That's a great response, Nina, and thanks for that. And for Dr. Graves posting also a nice reference to one of his articles. I think that this all makes sense, and I love the interdisciplinary component of this group. And part of my question is coming from thinking about teaching this more at the undergrad or graduate level, especially in a 4-field anthropology department. And we don't need to discuss this since this is we're already end of time, but I almost feel more comfortable going into a high school classroom to talk about this than a PhD seminar on it, especially with the cultural anthropologists, you know, people who don't have the scientific literacy necessarily, and they're more focused on the history of how science has been used, you know, pseudoscience and things like that. So that's a little more context for where I'm coming from with that question, but thanks for that.
Yeah, no, I think, Aaron, you know, it's often harder to, you know, to talk to undergraduates and graduate students because they already have their own intellectual constructs in many cases that are very rigid. And so you have to basically, you have to undertake implicit bias training with them, much like you would with, you know, police or Starbucks employees. So.
Okay, everyone, we're at the top of the hour, and so we're unfortunately going to have to end the conversation. I'm really sorry about that because there are a lot of really great questions in the chat box that haven't been answered. But I think that just reflects what an interesting, what a fascinating and multi-dimensional topic this is. And so I just want to thank you, Nina, again for a great presentation. Joe, did you have anything else you wanted to say, or?
I was just going to say the same thing that you said, Charlie. Fantastic presentation, Nina. It's always wonderful to hear your work.
Well, again, thank you very much for inviting me, and I'm thrilled to know of the existence of this club, and I look forward to joining as an audience member in coming weeks and months.
That's great. We'd love to have you. And speaking of which, we have another Club EvMed on the schedule for next week. It will be Tuesday at noon Eastern Time. We have Verena Schoenemann from University of Zurich, from the Institute of Evolutionary Medicine there. And she's going to be talking about, we have a title, it's Tracing Pathogens Through Time with Ancient DNA. And so I think this is our first foray into ancient DNA in Club EvMed. And I want to encourage everyone to please join us next week. And as many of you know, we also are lining up many other speakers. We have some people lined up, but just not titles or dates set yet. So please stay tuned for more information on Club EvMed. And with that, I'll thank every one of you for joining. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Meredith, for running this so smoothly as always. And thank you again, Nina, for taking the time to share your work with us. This was really fascinating. And Joe, thank you.
Great. Bye-bye.
Take care, everyone.